The early evening news now on BBC One Wales with Clive Myrie in Glasgow.
Good afternoon from Glasgow, where the president of the COP26 climate negotiations has made a plea to delegates to accept a third draft agreement setting out a path to combat rising global temperatures. Alok Sharma said this is a moment of truth for our planet, and it's a moment of truth for our children and grandchildren. Two previous draft deals have already been rejected, and balancing the interests of more than 190 countries here in Glasgow has been difficult. But Mr. Sharma is hoping the new text could be adopted sometime later today. Well, among its fresh proposals, governments are being urged to accelerate the phasing out of unfiltered coal plants, which are the worst polluting, and get rid of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. There's a call for more money to help developing countries adapt to climate change, and delegates must pledge to update their climate plans for deeper emissions cuts by the end of next year. With the very latest on a tense day of talks, here's our science editor, David Shulman.
The day began with confusion and uncertainty. A delivery of what looked like pizza boxes, in fact documents for the UN Secretary-General. There's a great deal at stake here, and one of the biggest disputes is over the future of coal.
We all agree that climate change is the biggest threat to our civilization. We all know what the causes are, and one of them is coal.
But the big coal producers don't accept that.
I think we are now ready to start.
Negotiators immediately broke up into huddles, and we got a rare glimpse of the bargaining that normally happens behind closed doors. The American envoy John Kerry deep in discussion with China's chief negotiator Xie Jinhua, arguing line by line, hour after hour. And eventually the man in the hot seat, Alok Sharma, called everyone together to make a last appeal for cooperation.
We've had 2 incredibly intense weeks of negotiations in Glasgow, and we arrive at what I believe is the moment of truth. And this is the moment of truth for our planet. And it's a moment of truth for our children and our grandchildren.
While the real world is facing fires, floods and future disasters, it does feel bizarre that in here they're arguing over individual words about fossil fuels, climate policy and the future of international aid. But that is how it works. So the first draft of the agreement, that had to be amended. So did the second. We're now on to the third. Who knows if it'll be the last. Of all the disagreements, it's help for the poorest countries that remains one of the most serious. They say the rich nations that caused climate change should be providing far more assistance.
They promised $100 billion a year, and they haven't delivered it. In fact, they've inserted language, which is the most peculiar language, saying they apologize that they haven't delivered it. What are they coming here to do here?
So are the talks getting anywhere? Some are now worried.
But for heaven's sake, don't kill this moment by asking for more text, different text, deleting this, deleting that. Everyone's been heard by the presidency.
It's now crunch time, and we'll soon see who's prepared to compromise.
David, the talks, they're already into extra time. They should have ended this time yesterday. Is there a sense, despite the pleas of Alok Sharma, that perhaps we might not reach a deal by the end of the day? And the president has already made it clear he would like this summit to end by the end of the day.
Hard to call, Clive. I mean, this is the time of maximum tension at this conference, like at every other before it, where national interests are at stake, where we see how far countries are prepared to go to keep arguing to defend what they regard as precious, or indeed to keep arguing to avoid losing something that they regard as important. A classic example is India, clearly concerned about a line in the statement suggesting that coal should be phased out. India is a big producer and user of coal, so we'll have to see how that plays out. Also, the poorest nations, who all the way through this conference have been deeply disappointed, feeling betrayed about aid that they were promised that still hasn't been delivered. That remains a major concern for them. We'll have to see how much they push for that to be changed in the final agreement. Alex Sharma, as you say, he's saying he's determined to wrap this up tonight. Frankly, it's not totally in his gift. If the big powers or groups of countries insist on continuing to push for what they want, well, that's what will happen, and it will take longer.
Okay, David, thank you. David Shukman there on the conference floor. Well, what's been difficult here in Glasgow is balancing the varying interests of developing countries, those that have been industrialising fast in recent years, like India, for whom fossil fuels have benefited their economy, and others like the smaller island nations of the Pacific, for whom rising global temperatures are an existential threat. Let's talk now to our South Asia correspondent, Rajini Vaidyanathan, who's in Delhi for us now. Rajini, what were the Indians hoping for from the meetings here in Glasgow? And is there any sense that they're going to get what they want?
Well, some context, of course, as you know, India is one of the world's largest emitters. It relies heavily on fossil fuels to power its economy. Some 70% of its power comes from coal. Now, at the COP summit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi promised to aggressively switch to renewables. He made that bold pledge of going net zero by 2070. But here is the sticking point, Clive. What India wants is the West to step up when it comes to climate finance. Now, at the summit, Prime Minister Modi said that in the past, the West has made what he described as hollow promises when it comes to climate funding. And so Indian officials really want to make sure that the West delivers when it comes to that. The other thing as well is just making sure that developed nations take the lead when it comes to reducing their dependence on fossil fuels. As Prime Minister Modi told the COP summit, 17% of the world's population lives in India, but only 5% of the world's emissions come from here.
Okay, Rajini, thank you. Rajini Vaidyanathan there, live in Delhi. We're going to move on now to our other main story. And border guards in Poland have accused Belarusian soldiers of trying to destroy a section of fencing to try to let migrants cross into the country. They say troops used a vehicle to tear out fence posts and razor wire. Well, Western nations have condemned Belarus for the growing crisis on its border with Poland, where thousands of migrants are stranded in freezing conditions. Our correspondent Steve Rosenberg is in Belarus, and he sent this report from close to the Polish border.
Winter is coming in Belarus. So at the migrant camp, they're gathering whatever they can to build some shelter. But for the people camping out, there is little protection. And no one knows how long they're going to be here.
We can't stay more because the weather is too cold. The people maybe day by day will die here from cold.
So Omar, you'll have to go back to your country, no?
Never. We never go back to our home. We better die here, no go back to our country.
Poland is so close. They're living on the EU's doorstep. Poland now has 15,000 troops in this area, guarding Europe's border.
These people have come to Belarus with one aim, to try to use this country to get to Europe. And look how close they've got. I mean, the European Union, it's almost within touching distance. But as you can see, Poland is determined not to let them through.
Many of these people are from the Middle East. The EU has accused Belarus of facilitating their journey here, of bringing them to the border to pressure Europe. Belarus denies that. As for the migrants, they're desperate to leave here.
We want to go. We want to stay here.
Where do you want to go?
Europe or US or Canada, don't matter.
Go back! Go back!
Belarusian police are trying to keep order.
Go back, please, go back!
But there's been a delivery of humanitarian aid. This is what happens when you're hungry and cold.
Well, this is the chaos of the migrant camp. Aid is being distributed, in this case, blankets and clothes, and people are desperate to receive it. But the police are struggling to maintain control. They're telling people to get down while the aid's being given out.
Sit down! Sit down!
For these people, at this moment, their priority isn't Europe, it's survival. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, on the border of Belarus and Poland.
Well, that's it. I'll be back with a full roundup at 10:40. Now on BBC One. Time for all the news where you are. Bye for now.